I had been married to Crispin Larkspur for 41 years the morning he told me he wanted something new. 41 years. I remember thinking that number had the weight of a stone in my hand. 41 autumns of raking leaves off the same slate walk. 41 Christmases of roasting the same goose the way his mother taught me before she died. 41 Easters of pastel eggs hidden in the same hydrangea bushes for two children who had long since grown into adults I barely recognized. And now at the kitchen island he picked out in 2004, standing in his navy cardigan with the leather elbow patches I had mended twice, he told me he wanted something new. Her name was Celeste Vaillancourt, 43 years old, an accountant at the firm that handled his practice. He had been seeing her, he said, for almost 2 years. He said the word almost like it made a difference. He said it the way a man says a small number when he is trying to make a large one sound less ugly. I did not cry. I sat on the oak stool, and I looked at the grain of the countertop, the dark whorls in the marble, and I listened to him explain in his careful, lawyerly voice that the house was held by an LLC. The cars were held by an LLC. The retirement accounts had been restructured some years ago. My name, he said, as if he were reading a weather report, was not on the ownership documents. He said he was sorry. He said he would be fair. He said there was $18,000 in the joint checking account I could take. I took the $18,000. I took the 2011 Toyota Corolla with 140,000 miles on the odometer. I took my mother's pearls and the photograph of my grandmother Pina on her wedding day. I left the house that had never been mine. I drove to Burlington, Vermont, through a gray November rain that never quite turned to snow, and I arrived at my daughter Vivian's front door at 10 minutes past 9 on a Tuesday night, and she opened the door in her pajamas, and she did not say a single word of "I told you so." She just held me. She held me for a very long time. Her husband Dante stood behind her holding 2 mugs of tea he had already made. I slept on the pull-out couch in their den. My granddaughter Mietta, who was 11, brought me a stuffed rabbit she had loved when she was 4. My grandson Ambrose, who was 8, brought me a drawing he had done of a house with a yellow door. He did not know why he was giving me a house. He was a child. He understood only that his nonna had come to stay. I thought that was the end of my story. I was 63. I was broke. I was finished. I was wrong. I met Crispin at a Louisiana State University mixer in the spring of 1983. I was a graduate student in art history, writing my dissertation on the Italian frescoes of the Venetian Cinquecento. He was a second-year law student with a faint Alabama drawl and eyes the color of weak coffee. He told me my name sounded like a song, Odette Thibodeau, the way the syllables fell into each other. He walked me back to my apartment in the humid Baton Rouge night and quoted Yeats to me on the porch, and I thought, here is a man who is listening. We were married in the summer of 1984 in my grandmother Pina's garden in Hollis, Vermont. I had wanted Hollis because Pina had made it feel like a holy place to me. She had flown down from Vermont 3 times that year to help me pick a dress, to taste cakes with me, to hold my hand when my mother, her only daughter, called to say she would not be attending the wedding because she did not approve of Crispin's family. My mother and I were not close. My grandmother Pina was more mother to me than my mother had ever been. Pina's garden in June was full of peonies and white foxglove. She wore a lavender dress with a lace collar she had crocheted herself in the winter. My grandfather Tommaso had died 6 years earlier in 1978, and she wore his wedding ring on a gold chain around her neck that day. She kissed me on both cheeks and told me, in her soft Italian-American voice, that a woman must always know where her own ground is. I did not understand what she meant at the time. I was 22, and I thought I knew what ground I was standing on. I thought I was standing on love. I gave up my doctorate when we moved to Hartford in 1985. Crispin had been hired by a mid-tier firm that paid him enough for us to rent a small colonial on a tree-lined street, and there did not seem to be money for two careers, and he was sure, he said, that once he made partner, I could return to my studies. I never did. Malachi was born in 1987, Vivian in 1985, 18 months before her brother. There were diapers, and there were school plays, and there were parent-teacher conferences, and there were casseroles for sick neighbors, and there were Christmas cards that I addressed by hand, because Crispin said my handwriting was more personal than his. I made a life. I built it stone by stone. I made birthday cakes from scratch. I learned to reupholster a chair. I volunteered at the church thrift shop. I hosted the firm's Christmas party for 19 consecutive years. I made sure the children were fed, clothed, driven, encouraged, and loved. I made sure Crispin's shirts were pressed. I made sure his mother received a handwritten card on her birthday until the year she died. I made sure, and I made sure, and I made sure. And somewhere in the accumulation of all that making sure, I stopped being sure of myself. I stopped asking myself what I wanted. I stopped remembering that I had once wanted anything at all. The resentments came quietly. Crispin began staying late at the office in 2014 when he was 54 and I was 52. He began criticizing small things, the way I laughed at restaurants, the cardigan I wore to his firm's summer barbecue, my weight, which had not changed significantly in 10 years, my conversation, which he said had grown narrow. I had, he said, become provincial. I did not know what to do with that word. I had given him my entire adult life, and now the word he used for me was provincial. He stopped touching my shoulder when he passed me in the hallway. He stopped kissing my forehead when he came home from work. He stopped eating the dinners I made, saying he had already grabbed something in the city. He began using a new cologne, one I had not bought him. He began taking his phone to the bathroom with him. He began taking out-of-town conferences that I was not invited to. Conferences in cities I had always wanted to see. I saw the signs. I did not let myself see them. There is a kind of seeing we refuse because the alternative requires rearranging the entire furniture of our life. I kept rearranging the actual furniture instead. I repainted the dining room in 2022. I regrouted the kitchen backsplash in 2023. I planted 3 new hydrangeas in the spring of 2024. I was, without knowing it, trying to make the house love me since the man would not. Then came the kitchen island. Then came the word almost. Then came the LLC. Then came the $18,000. Then came the Corolla, the rainy highway, my daughter's front door. The first 6 months on Vivian's pull-out couch taught me what shame tastes like when you are past 60. It tastes like cold coffee you poured for yourself 3 hours ago and forgot. It tastes like the inside of a library in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when everyone else in your life has somewhere to be. It tastes like the quiet sound of your own daughter closing her bedroom door at night because she needs to have a marriage and you need to let her have it. I took the pull-out couch apart every morning at 6. I folded the sheets. I folded the blanket. I slid the mattress back inside the couch frame. I put the cushions on top. I did this so that the den looked like a den again before Mietta and Ambrose came down for breakfast. I did not want them to see where I slept. I wanted them to be able to watch cartoons on Saturday without stepping over the shape of their grandmother's failure. Malachi called once a week. Malachi was 38 years old, an investment analyst in Boston, and he had always been his father's child. He called to tell me I was being dramatic. He called to tell me his father had made mistakes, but that I was not without fault either. He called to suggest I move to a senior rental in Hartford so that I could be closer to my old friends, by which he meant so that I could be farther from anything that might embarrass him. I stopped answering the phone on Wednesdays, which was when he called. Vivian was different. Vivian had her father's quiet mouth and her grandmother Pina's steady eyes. She was 40 years old, a pediatric nurse practitioner at the university hospital, and she ran her household, the way Pina had run her kitchen. She let me live. She did not ask me to explain myself. She did not try to fix me. She let me read her old paperbacks on the couch, and she let me walk her neighbor's golden retriever for $15 a day. And she let me bake brownies with Miette on Sunday afternoons. Dante was a good man. He was a carpenter, born in New Haven to Dominican parents, and he came home every evening smelling of sawdust and orange oil, and he would sit at the kitchen table and ask me about my day, as if a woman on a pull-out couch had a day worth reporting. He made me feel, for the first time in a long time, like a person rather than a problem. I walked dogs. I read novels at the Fletcher Free Library. I went to bed at 10, and I lay awake until 3. I watched the light of a street lamp through the curtain, and I counted the 41 years of my marriage on my fingers like rosary beads. I was 63 years old. I was broke. I had no career. I had no home. I had no husband. I had a Corolla and $18,000 and a daughter who loved me. I thought that was the full accounting. I was wrong again. The phone call came on a Thursday in late October at 9:17 in the morning. I was in the kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea. Vivian had gone to work. Dante had taken the kids to school. The house was quiet. The phone on the counter rang with a number I did not recognize, a Vermont area code, and I almost did not pick it up. I was 63 years old, and I had learned to be afraid of unfamiliar numbers. I picked it up. The voice on the other end was deep, unhurried, with the careful vowels of an educated West African English settling into 40 years of Vermont winters. "Is this Odette Carraro Thibodeau?" My grandmother's maiden name. No one had called me Carraro in decades. "This is she." "My name is Balthazar Ogunlé. I was your grandmother's lawyer for 40 years. I do not know if you remember meeting me." I did remember, faintly. A tall, soft-spoken man in a gray suit at Pina's funeral 8 years earlier. He had held my hand at the graveside and told me my grandmother had loved me very much. I had thanked him and moved on because I had a husband's arm to hold. "I remember, Mr. Ogunlé." "Please, Balthazar. Mrs. Thibodeau, I have been holding something for you for a long time. Your grandmother left me a sealed letter and a key with instructions. She asked that I deliver them only when you found yourself, in her words, in the wilderness. I have been watching for news of you with some care. I was sorry to hear about your divorce." I sat down. I had not been sitting before. The stool scraped the tile. "How did you hear?" "Your cousin Marco sent a notice to your grandmother's old parish newsletter in Hollis. It reached me by Monday. Your grandmother's instructions were quite specific. The wilderness, she said, could mean illness, widowhood, or what she called a sudden emptying of the house. I believe the third condition has been met." I did not know what to say. I wrapped both hands around the teacup. "What is it that she left me?" "That," he said, "is what the letter explains. I would prefer to give it to you in person. Can you drive to Montpelier on Monday? My office is on State Street. I will make the afternoon free." I said I could drive to Montpelier on Monday. I wrote the address down on the back of a grocery receipt. I hung up the phone. I sat at the kitchen island in my daughter's house, and I listened to my own breathing for a long time. I did not know what a sealed letter from my dead grandmother could possibly contain after 8 years. I only knew that Pina had always known things before anyone told her. She had known I would marry Crispin before I knew. She had known, apparently, that he would one day walk me out of the house with $18,000 and a Corolla. And she had prepared. On Monday morning, I drove east on Route 2 through October that was burning itself out in slow motion. The maples were down to their last copper leaves. The birches had gone bare. The light came through the hills at a low angle that made everything gold and a little mournful. The Corolla's heater rattled the way it had rattled for 6 years. I kept both hands on the wheel, and I did not turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my grandmother. I thought she might say something if I listened. Balthazar Ogunle's office was on the second floor of a narrow red brick row building across from the Vermont State House. A small brass plaque on the door read, Ogunle Estates and Trusts, established 1979. He met me at the top of the stairs. He was taller than I remembered, 68 years old now, completely white-haired, wearing a charcoal suit and a pale blue tie, and his handshake was firm and dry. "Mrs. Thibodeau, thank you for coming, please." He led me into a book-lined office that smelled of pipe tobacco and leather. He poured me a cup of strong coffee from a brass French press. On his desk, in front of an empty blotter, sat a manila envelope and a small velvet-lined jewelry box. "Your grandmother," he said, "was one of the most precise human beings I have ever met. She was also one of the kindest. She came to see me in the autumn of 2017, 9 months before her death, and she revised her instructions one final time. She told me, and I quote, 'Balthazar, my granddaughter Odette, has married a man who will one day leave her for someone younger. I have watched him at Thanksgiving for 30 years. I know the shape of his eyes when he thinks no one is watching. When it happens, I want you to find her.'" I did not cry. I held the coffee cup, and I did not cry. "She left you the key in this box," he said, sliding the velvet case across the desk. "And a letter I am not permitted to read, only to deliver. The key opens a building in Hollis. You may know the building. The old Cresson Flour Mill office on Cresson Brook. Your grandfather Tommaso used that office for 36 years for his grain trade work. After he died, your grandmother kept it closed. She paid the taxes on it every year until her death. The taxes are now paid out of a small trust she established, which I administer. The building is fully yours." I opened the velvet case. Inside was a single brass key, old but bright, the kind a locksmith in 1888 would have forged on a coal forge. The bow of the key was shaped like a scroll. I held it in my palm, and it was heavier than I expected. "Would you like me to drive you there?" Balthazar asked. "It is 34 miles. I have the afternoon." I said yes. I could not have driven myself. My hands were shaking in a way I did not want him to see. We drove north in his silver 2014 Lincoln Town car. He drove slowly, the way a man drives when he has nothing left to prove. We went up Route 12 through Worcester and Elmore, past the long gray bones of old dairy barns, past cornfields cut down to their stubble. We passed a covered bridge at Waterbury Center that I remembered from a childhood trip with Pina. We passed a cider mill with a hand-painted sign reading, "Fresh Sweet Today." The road narrowed. The hills leaned closer. He turned left onto a 2-lane blacktop marked only by a wooden sign that read, Hollis 4. Hollis sat in a cupped hollow between two ridges, a single main street with a white clapboard general store and a steepled congregational church, and a brick post office the size of a small living room. Population, I learned later, from a sign at the town line, 1,800. Cresson Brook ran black and quick behind the main street. We turned down an unmarked gravel lane, and there, set back in a clearing ringed by bare sugar maples, stood my grandfather Tommaso's flour mill. The mill itself was enormous, 3 stories of weathered wooden clapboard, painted red a century ago and faded now to the color of old brick dust. A great wooden water wheel, half rotted, leaned over the brook. The windows of the mill were boarded. A chain and padlock hung on the front door. But 40 feet south of the mill, separated from it by a flagstone path grown over with moss, stood a second building, and that one made me forget how to breathe. It was 2 stories of dark red brick, the mortar still clean. A slate roof with a copper ridge cap. Tall arched windows on both floors, each framed by green wooden shutters. A stained glass transom above the front door in a pattern of wheat sheaves and blue diamonds. The numerals 1888 were set into the brick above the door in terracotta. "The office building," Balthazar said. Your grandfather built it for his clerks, the grain weighers, and the ledger keepers. After the mill closed in 1961, he used it only for himself. He spent most of his days here until he died. We walked up the flagstone path. The key turned in the heavy oak door as if it had been waiting for exactly my hand. The door swung inward with a long, low creak that sounded, I swear to you, like a sigh of relief. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Old paper, iron, the ghost of wood smoke in the grain of the pine floor. Something else underneath, something I could not name then, but later came to recognize as the linseed oil my grandfather had used on his desk. The front room was 24 feet deep and 18 feet wide. The ceilings were 12 feet high and pressed tin, painted a pale green that had faded to the color of lichen. On the west wall, a large oil painting in a gilt frame. My grandmother Pina, at 30 years old, seated in a garden in a blue dress, a small smile playing at the corner of her mouth. I had never seen the painting before. I did not know it existed. The center of the room held a roll-top mahogany desk, the top closed, the wood polished by decades of my grandfather's sleeves. Behind the desk, a swivel chair of oak and green leather. To the left of the desk, a cast-iron Franklin wood stove, cold now, with a brass kettle still sitting on top as if waiting for water. On the north wall, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves of dark oak, 12 feet high, filled with hundreds of leather-bound ledgers and journals. A rolling library ladder on a brass rail. A worn Persian runner, mostly red, on the floor between the desk and the stove. He did his own bookkeeping, Balthazar said quietly. Every ledger on that wall is in his hand. Your grandmother kept them all after he died. She told me once she came here some afternoons just to sit at his desk. I walked to the desk. I ran my palm along the roll of the top. I pushed it up. It rolled back with a sound like a soft exhalation. Inside, a blotter, an inkwell of cut crystal, a brass letter opener, a fountain pen in a holder, the nib still bright. A leather-bound appointment book open to October of 1978, his last month. His handwriting, careful and slightly slanted, with the date October 14th underlined and the words, Alina Lunch, written beside it. I put my hand on the blotter and I finally cried. Not for Crispin, not for the house in Hartford, for my grandfather, whom I had loved, and for my grandmother, who had somehow known that one day I would stand in this room and need this room, and had arranged for the key to find me. Balthazar stood quietly by the door. He was a man who understood when to be silent. After a long time I straightened. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my cardigan. I looked at him. What do I do now? Whatever you want, Mrs. Thibodeau. The building is yours. The land beneath it is yours. The mill is yours. Your grandmother set up a small maintenance fund that has covered taxes and basic upkeep for the last 8 years. There is about $4,000 remaining in it. Beyond that, the next step is yours to choose. I chose, that afternoon, to stay. I drove back to Burlington. I packed a single duffel bag. I kissed my daughter and my grandchildren, and on Wednesday of that same week, I drove the Corolla back to Hollis with everything I owned in the trunk. I rented a small apartment above a bakery on Main Street. The bakery was called Morkin's, and it was run by a Norwegian woman named Hedda Morkin, who was 71 and baked cardamom bread on Tuesdays. My apartment was one room with a slanted ceiling, a single window that looked out over Main Street, a gas stove, a twin bed, and a clawfoot tub. The rent was $450 a month. I paid 6 months up front in cash, and Hedda counted the bills slowly and gave me a loaf of cardamom bread as a welcome. The first days at the office, I cleaned. I did not touch the ledgers. I did not touch the journals. I did not open the painting's frame to look for secrets. I swept. I mopped. I washed the transom windows with vinegar water and a soft cloth. I beat the Persian runner against the flagstone path until dust rose like a brown cloud into the bright October air. I laid a fire in the Franklin wood stove using kindling. I found stacked in a brass tub beside it. Kindling my grandfather had split sometime before I was born. The stove drew perfectly. The chimney had been maintained. I sat by the fire on the oak chair, and I drank black tea from the brass kettle. And for the first time since the morning at the kitchen island, I did not feel that I was fading. Malachi called on Friday. He had heard somehow that I had moved to Hollis. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You are living in some abandoned mill in a town of 1,800 people in Vermont. The place is worthless. Sell it. Come back to Hartford. You can stay with Dad's cousin Maureen until we find you something." I listened. I looked at the roll-top desk. I looked at the painting of Pina. I looked at the north wall of ledgers. "Thank you, Malachi. I am fine." "You are not fine. You are having a breakdown. I can get a real estate agent up there this weekend." "I am not having a breakdown. I am having a life. I will call you on Sunday." I hung up. I did not call him on Sunday. I did not call him for 3 weeks. He did not call me either, because once the words were not going his way, he did not need them. Vivian drove up the following Saturday with Mietta and Ambrose. Dante came too with his truck, and he brought me a cast-iron skillet, a set of sheets, a small electric kettle, a lamp, and a rocking chair he had made in his workshop the week before out of curly maple. I cried on his shoulder for a full minute. Mietta and Ambrose ran through the office building like puppies, opening and closing every door. Ambrose declared the roll-top desk the best desk he had ever seen. Mietta stood for a long time in front of the portrait of Pina and said, "Nona, she looks like you." Elena Fiorentino came on Sunday. She was 85 years old, my grandmother's oldest friend, still living in the same yellow farmhouse on Ridge Road she had lived in for 60 years. She came in a long wool coat, and she carried a covered enamel pot of minestrone, and she set it on the Franklin stove, and she kissed me on both cheeks, and said, "Odette, you came home. I told your grandmother you would." She sat by the stove, and she told me stories I had never heard. She told me how Pina had met Tommaso on a ship from Genoa to New York in 1947, both of them 23, both of them traveling alone. She told me how Tommaso had bought the flour mill and the office in 1952 with money borrowed from 3 Italian families in Boston. She told me how Pina had kept the books beside him for 9 years before Vivian's mother, my own mother, was born. She told me how the mill had closed in 1961 when the big commercial flour operations drove out the small ones, and how Tommaso had refused to sell the buildings, saying, "A man does not sell his house because the weather has turned." She patted my hand. Her hand was thin and freckled and warm. "Odette, your grandfather left things in that building, things your grandmother knew about. She told me once there was a quiet room. She did not tell me where. She said it was for you, if ever you needed it." I did not know what she meant. I said I did not know what she meant. She smiled and said, "You will find it, Cara. He made it for a careful reader. You were always a careful reader." After she left, I went to the north wall. I pulled down the first ledger. The spine was worn, but the leather was oiled. Inside, in my grandfather's slanting pen, the heading read, "Tommaso Carraro, Proprietor, Crescent Mill, 1952. The pages were columns of figures, bushels and prices, and names of farmers I did not know. I turned the pages slowly. I found his handwriting comforting. I did not find any hidden messages, not that night. I read the ledgers for 3 weeks. I read them by lamplight in the evenings after I had swept the floors during the day. I read them with a cup of tea at my elbow and the Franklin stove burning applewood Hedda's son delivered to me by the cord. I learned how a flour mill worked. I learned the names of the local farmers. I learned the going price of winter wheat in 1954, and how my grandfather had paid 15 cents above market rate to a widow named Mrs. Annette Poirier, whose husband had died that year. I learned that he had not billed a farmer named Dubois for 3 consecutive months in 1957 because Dubois had lost his wife in childbirth. My grandfather had been a quiet, kind man. The ledgers told me so in small numbers. Then I moved to the journals. The journals were different from the ledgers. The journals were bound in dark green cloth, narrower, kept on the top shelf. There were 21 of them, one for each year from 1958 to 1978. My grandfather had kept them in his own hand, in ink, in the evenings. I read them in chronological order. I read slowly with a pencil and a small notebook of my own to record anything that made me pause. And slowly, across many nights, a second story began to rise up out of the first one. The official story was a man running a country flour mill through its slow decline. The second story was a man building a careful hidden architecture of protection for the women who would come after him. If you have ever been the woman in your family who gave everything and now sits on a pull-out couch wondering whether you have the right to a second chapter, subscribe if you believe a woman can start over at any age. I wanted to say that now because I do believe it, and because a stranger told it to me when I needed it, and I want to be that stranger for someone else. The first entry that made me stop was dated April 19, 1963. My grandfather had written, "Bought the upper 180 from Mr. Hollis Cresson himself today, $3,600 cash, hand to hand in his kitchen with his wife, as witness. The land abuts the mill to the north and east and climbs to the ridge. It is unbuildable by current standards, which is why it can be had at this price. It will not be unbuildable forever. Pina and I have agreed it is for Giovanna's daughters, if she ever has them. A woman needs her own ground. Giovanna was my mother. Giovanna's daughter was me. I was the only one. I sat by the lamplight and I read that entry 3 times, and then I wrote the date in my notebook, and I wrote the words, upper 180, in careful block letters, and I underlined them twice. The second entry that made me stop was dated August 3, 1971. Drove to Boston today and met with Mr. Lieberman on Bromfield Street. Bought 42 1-ounce American Gold Eagles, $35 per ounce. He wrapped them in a velvet cloth and put them in a mahogany box. I told him they were a wedding gift for a goddaughter who does not yet exist. He did not ask questions. Gold is a quiet metal. Inflation is not. Pina approves. The box will go with the other things. The other things. I wrote that down too. American Gold Eagles, by the way, were not minted until 1986. What my grandfather called eagles in 1971 were almost certainly double eagles or Krugerrands, but I did not know this then. I only knew there was a mahogany box somewhere with 42 gold coins in it, and that he had intended them for a girl who did not yet exist, and that the girl who did not yet exist might very well have turned out to be me. The third entry that made me stop was dated February 14, 1979, 7 months after Tommaso's death. It was in Pina's handwriting, not his. She had evidently continued the journal for him in her own softer script for reasons of her own. Took the bearer bonds out of the bank box in Boston today and brought them home in my purse. Balthazar has set up the Carraro Family Trust. 47 Series E and Series EE bonds, face values ranging from $100 to $1,000, all registered to the trust. Tommaso would have wanted them kept close. The bank gives too many strangers too many keys. They will go in the Schwab with the rest. The quiet room must stay quiet. The quiet room must stay quiet. That line appeared 6 more times across the next 7 years of entries, always in Pina's handwriting, always with a date after Tommaso's death. The quiet room must stay quiet. The quiet room must stay quiet. I did not know what the quiet room was. I began to believe it existed. I went through the office building from corner to corner. I tapped on walls. I pulled up the edges of the Persian runner. I opened every drawer of the roll-top desk, and I found a silver pocket watch and a pair of reading glasses and a photograph of my mother as a baby, but I did not find a room. I climbed to the second floor, which was a single large storage room with 3 old wooden filing cabinets and a leaded glass window looking east toward the ridge, and I found no room there either. I stood in the front room and I turned in a slow circle, and I looked at the north wall of oak bookshelves, and I said aloud to my grandfather, "Tommaso, where did you put it?" On a cold night in early November, the wind coming down off the ridge in long, low sighs, I sat reading by lamplight, and I leaned back in the oak swivel chair, and I stretched, and my shoulder brushed the north bookshelf. Something shifted, very slightly. A sound like a small brass click. I held perfectly still. I got up. I walked to the bookshelf. I pressed my palm flat against the third shelf from the top, where my shoulder had touched it. Nothing happened. I pressed a little higher. Nothing. I pressed a little lower, on the edge of the second shelf. A louder click. The entire middle section of the bookshelf, 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, moved inward a quarter of an inch on a hinge I could not see. I pushed. The bookshelf pivoted inward on a vertical pin. The books did not fall, because the shelves were fixed with small brass rails at the front. The whole section swung open like a door in a cathedral. Behind it was the quiet room. It was small, 8 feet by 10 feet. The walls were lined with cedar planks. The floor was cork. The ceiling held a single overhead bulb that, as I stepped forward, clicked on by itself, triggered by a motion sensor my grandfather had evidently installed at some point in the 1990s. The air inside was strangely fresh and dry, a little cool, as if the room had been pulling in filtered outside air through a vent I could not see. I later learned that Tommaso had installed a small passive dehumidifier and an exchange vent in 1962 when he first built the room, and Pina had upgraded the motion sensor and bulb in 1995. They had wanted nothing in this room to rot. In the center of the room stood a heavy green safe. The word Eschwab was painted in gold on the door. It was a cast-iron safe from the early 1900s with a brass combination dial and a brass handle. To the left of the safe, a small cedar chest. To the right, on a low cherry table, a mahogany box about 12 inches long and 8 inches deep. Above the cherry table, mounted on the wall, a small brass plaque that read Carraro in block letters. Under the plaque, a sealed manila envelope with my name on it in Pina's looping Italian-American hand, Odette. I stood in the doorway and I could not make my feet move for a long time. When I could move, I walked to the cherry table and I picked up the manila envelope. It was heavy. I broke the seal with my thumb and I slid out a stack of folded papers. 8 sheets, cream-colored, closely written on both sides. The top sheet began, "My beautiful Odette." I sat down on the cork floor with my back against the cedar wall, and I read my grandmother's last letter to me by the light of a bulb her husband had installed in a room they had hidden for me. My beautiful Odette, if Balthazar has given you this key, it means you have been made to feel small. Listen to me now. I watched your husband at Thanksgiving for 30 years. He has a coldness in his eyes when he thinks no one is watching, a coldness that I have seen in other men, and those men all eventually left the women who loved them. I did not tell you this while I was alive because you had to live your own life, and I did not want to poison your love for him. But I prepared. Your grandfather prepared. The safe on this floor holds 47 bearer bonds registered to the Carraro Family Trust and a box of 42 gold coins. The envelope on top of them holds the original purchase deed for 180 acres of Mountain View Forest that abuts this property to the north and east. The land is yours. The coins are yours. The bonds are yours. The combination to the safe is the date your grandfather and I were married, 11/4/52, November 4th, 1952, on the Lucas City Hall steps on a rainy Tuesday morning with only my mother and his brother as witnesses. I wore a brown suit. He wore a gray one. We were very happy. Stand on your own ground now, Odette. Your own ground, your own door, your own key. I love you. Nonna Pina. I put the letter down. I turned to the safe. My hand shook a little on the dial. 11. I turned the dial clockwise past 0 once, then stopped at 11. 4. Counterclockwise past 11 once, then stopped at 4. 52. Clockwise, direct to 52. I pulled the brass handle. The door of the safe opened as smoothly as the door of a kitchen cabinet. The hinges were oiled. Everything in this room had been oiled. Inside the safe, on the top shelf, a flat leather folio. I lifted it out and opened it. 47 U.S. savings bonds, Series E and Series EE, issued between 1978 and 1992. Face values of $100, $200, $500, and $1,000. Each bond registered to the Carraro Family Trust, each bond bearing the trust's serial number and my grandmother's faded signature at the bottom. I ran my finger down the serial numbers. J4872991E, L0023447EM, 99162884EE. The paper was crisp. The ink was unfaded. They had been kept in cedar and cool air for 40 years. I did not then know what those bonds were worth. I would later learn, after Balthazar walked me through the redemption process, that with 40 years of accrued interest compounded at the Treasury's rates, the total redemption value of those 47 bonds was approximately $380,000. On the second shelf of the safe, the mahogany box. I lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the cherry table. I opened it. Inside, velvet-lined, were 42 one-ounce gold coins. Some of them were American Gold Eagles from the late 1980s. Some were older Krugerrands from the 1970s, which must have been what my grandfather called Eagles in his 1971 journal. I counted them twice. 42. At the current spot price of gold, I would later learn, the total was approximately $134,000. On the bottom shelf of the safe, a stiff manila envelope. I lifted it out. Inside, a single folded document on heavy rag paper. A warranty deed, dated April 19, 1963, conveying from Hollis M. Cresson and wife to Tommaso Carraro 180 acres of land described by metes and bounds, beginning at an iron pin at the northeast corner of the Cresson flour mill property and running north-northeast along the ridge for 3,200 feet, and so on. The deed was notarized. It had been recorded in the Hollis Town Clerk's office on April 22, 1963. The recording stamp was visible in the margin. My grandfather's signature was on the back. Under the deed, a second document. A hand-drawn family genealogy on a single large folded sheet, executed in my grandfather's careful ink. Carraro, Belluno, Italy, 1780. Stefano Carraro, stonemason, married Maria Vianello. Their son Giovanni, born 1806. His son Matteo, born 1831. His son Arturo, born 1859, emigrated from Belluno to Genoa 1880. His son Luigi, born 1892 in Genoa, married Teresa Bianchi. Their son Tommaso, born 1924 in Genoa. Tommaso married Giuseppina Molinari, born 1924, in Lucca. Their daughter Giovanna Carraro, born 1953 in Hollis, Vermont. Her daughter Odette Thibodeau, née Carraro, born 1961 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. My grandfather had traced me back to a stonemason in the Italian Alps in 1780. He had wanted me to know where I came from. He had wanted me, I think, to know that I was descended from people who had built things out of stone and sweat and quiet, and that I was not the first woman in the line who had needed to know her own ground. I sat on the cork floor of the quiet room for a long time. I did not count. I did not calculate. I did not think about what any of it was worth. I thought about my grandmother in a brown suit on the Lucca City Hall steps in November of 1952. I thought about my grandfather carrying a velvet bag of gold coins on a train from Boston to Hollis in August of 1971. I thought about them together night after night, deciding what to leave a girl who did not yet exist. I thought about the phrase, your own ground, your own door, your own key. I said it aloud, alone, in the cedar-scented air, my own ground, my own door, my own key. I did not sleep that night. I closed the quiet room. I locked the office. I drove the Corolla back to Main Street. I went up to my small apartment over the bakery. I lay on the twin bed, and I watched the streetlight on my ceiling. I was 63 years old. I had $18,000 and a Corolla. I also apparently had 180 acres of Mountain View forest, $380,000 in bearer bonds, $134,000 in gold, a Victorian brick office building, a ruined flour mill, and a dead grandmother who had loved me enough to spend 40 years preparing for the worst day of my life. The next morning I drove back to Montpellier, and I sat in Balthazar Augenlai's office, and I told him everything. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he took off his reading glasses, and he cleaned them slowly with a cloth from his drawer. "Mrs. Thibodeau, Odette, your grandparents set this up with a great deal of care. The Carraro Family Trust is active. I am the administrator. The trust owns the bonds and the coins. The deed is in your grandfather's personal name, which means it passed through your grandmother's estate and now sits in a small residual trust I established at her request in 2018, of which you are the sole beneficiary. Everything can be transferred to your sole personal name within approximately 60 days if you wish. I recommend that you redeem the bonds through the Treasury, not a private buyer. I recommend that you hold the gold or sell through a reputable Boston dealer. I strongly recommend that you do not sell any of the land to the first buyer who comes to your door." I looked at him. "Why do you say that?" He smiled a small, careful smile. "Because the first buyer has already started to come. Word travels in small Vermont towns within 3 or 4 days. I received a call this morning from a developer named Regina Thistlewood. She asked whether the Crescent property was on the market. She asked what I knew about the title. I told her nothing. She will be at your office within the week." Regina Thistlewood arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I heard her before I saw her. A black Mercedes SUV rolled up the gravel lane and parked, engine idling, in front of the office. The driver's door opened and a tall woman stepped out. She was 58 years old, I would later learn, blonde hair swept up, a camel-colored cashmere coat, tall leather boots. She looked like she had walked out of a real estate magazine. She knocked on the oak door with 3 crisp taps. I let her in. I offered her tea. She did not sit down. "Mrs. Thibodeau, my name is Regina Thistlewood. I own Thistlewood Properties out of Stowe. I have been interested in this parcel for a very long time. Your grandmother was kind enough to correspond with me briefly some years ago. I understand the property has recently come into your hands. I would like to offer you $600,000 cash, close in 30 days, for the mill building, the office building, and the 180 acres to the north. I can have a cashier's check in your hand by Monday." She smiled. She had very white teeth. "Mrs. Thistlewood, I appreciate your visit. I am not prepared to discuss a sale at this time." Her smile did not move. "I understand this is a lot to process. I should mention that there are some complications with the title to the 180. I have had my attorney take a preliminary look. Your grandfather's purchase in 1963 may not have been properly recorded. There is a question about whether the metes and bounds align with the modern survey. These things can drag through probate court for years. It is not the kind of cloud you want over an inheritance." I looked at her for a long time. I thought about my grandmother in a brown suit on the Lucas City Hall steps. I thought about my grandfather paying 15 cents above market to the widow Poirier in 1954. I thought about the recording stamp on the back of the 1963 deed. "Mrs. Thistlewood, thank you for stopping by. I will be in touch if I am interested in selling. I am not interested today." Her smile finally dropped. "I will leave my card. My offer stands for 2 weeks. I should warn you that if title issues do arise, the value of the property will fall substantially. You may wish to take the certainty now." I walked her to the door. I watched her black Mercedes roll back down the gravel lane. I waited until she was gone. I took her business card and I put it on the Franklin stove, and I watched it curl into ash. She came back 12 days later with a lawyer in a gray suit. She came back with a letter on her lawyer's letterhead that used phrases like title defects and potential quiet title action. She came back with her smile tightened and her voice a half-octave higher. I let her speak. I offered her tea. She did not take it. Mrs. Thistlewood, my lawyer is Balthazar Ogunleye of Ogunleye Estates and Trusts in Montpelier. He was my grandmother's lawyer for 40 years. He recorded the 1963 deed himself. He has the original in his office safe. You are welcome to communicate with him directly. I will not be responding to any further letters from your attorney. She left. She did not come back a third time. I hired a surveyor. His name was Everett Okonkwo, a licensed independent land surveyor out of Montpelier, 34 years old, born in Nigeria, educated at the University of Vermont. He came up in a green pickup truck with a small dog in the passenger seat. The dog was a border terrier named Mr. Biscuit. Everett spent 3 days walking the 180 acres with his GPS and his measuring tape and his old iron pins. He found each of the original corner pins my grandfather had set in 1963. He confirmed the meets and bounds. He delivered a survey map on parchment weight paper, signed and sealed, and he gave me an appraisal of $1,850,000 as recreational mountain acreage in today's market. I paid his bill. I walked him to his truck. I petted Mr. Biscuit. I watched Everett drive away down the gravel lane, and then I sat in the Corolla in my own driveway on my own ground, and I cried. I did not cry from joy. I cried from release. It is a different kind of crying. It is the kind you do when a long breath you did not know you were holding finally goes out of you. I met Wren Ashdown the following Tuesday. Wren was 31 years old, a land protection specialist at the Green Mountain Conservation Trust, a young woman with short dark hair and steady hazel eyes. She had driven up from Montpelier in a small blue Subaru. She walked the property with me. She knew the names of the trees. She knew the names of the birds. She pointed out an old cellar hole from a farmstead that had stood on the ridge in the 1820s, and she showed me a vernal pool where, she said, wood frogs bred each April. Mrs. Thibodeau, she said, this is a remarkable parcel. The ridge connects 2 existing conservation easements to the north. If we can add this, we will have an uninterrupted wildlife corridor of nearly 4,000 acres. We would be honored to work with you. I talked to Balthazar, I talked to Vivian, I talked to Pina, in my own way, late at night, by the Franklin stove. I decided. I kept 60 acres, including the mill, the office, and the first rise of the ridge, where I wanted to eventually build a small cottage. I sold 120 acres to the Green Mountain Conservation Trust at $10,000 per acre, a total of $1,200,000. I attached a conservation easement that will hold for as long as Vermont law allows. The land will never be developed. No luxury cabins, no gated roads. Regina Thistlewood got nothing. The papers were signed on a Friday in late November in Balthazar's office. Wren was there, I was there, Balthazar was there. Elena Fiorentino came along too in her long wool coat because she had known Pina and she wanted to witness. I signed my full name, Odette Carraro Thibodeau. For the first time in 41 years, I signed Carraro before I signed Thibodeau. Balthazar smiled when he saw me do it. He did not say anything. He did not have to. The news of the sale got to Malachi within a week. I do not know who told him. Perhaps Hedda at the bakery. Perhaps the woman at the general store. It does not matter. Malachi called me on a Wednesday morning, and this time I answered, because I wanted to know what he would say. Mom, I heard about the Conservation Trust deal. That is wonderful. That is really wonderful. Listen, I have been thinking. You are going to have a lot of money coming in. The bonds, the gold, the land. You need someone who knows how to manage a portfolio of that size. My firm has a private wealth division. I can get you in with our top fiduciary. We would take great care of you." I let him finish. I let him say the phrase, "take great care of you," without interrupting him. I had learned something in the last 6 months. I had learned that a woman does not have to leap into every opening she is offered. A woman can listen to the whole sentence first. "Malachi, thank you. I have already retained an independent fiduciary in Montpelier, recommended by Balthazar. Her name is Ms. Annika Pelletier. She has worked with estates in Vermont for 22 years. I am very happy with her. I do not need another advisor." There was a silence on the other end of the phone. I could hear him breathing. I could hear the small noises of his Boston office in the background, the hum of a printer, someone laughing in a nearby cubicle. "Mom, you are making a mistake. Small-town advisors don't have the tools to manage this kind of money." "Malachi, I am not making a mistake. I am making a choice. There is a difference. Goodbye, sweetheart. Please give my love to your wife." I hung up. He did not call again for 3 months. When he did call, in February, he did not mention money. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. I meant it. Crispin sent a letter. It arrived in my mailbox at the bakery in a cream-colored envelope addressed in his careful, lawyerly hand. Odette Thibodeau, care of Morgan's Bakery, Hollis, Vermont. I took it down to the office that afternoon. I did not open it. I opened the door of the Franklin wood stove. I put the letter, unopened, into the bed of red coals. It caught at one corner, and then at another. It curled, it blackened, it became ash. I closed the door of the stove. I poured myself a cup of tea from the brass kettle. I sat in my grandfather's oak swivel chair at my grandfather's roll-top mahogany desk under the gilt-framed painting of my grandmother at 30 years old. I looked at her face. She was still smiling that small smile at the corner of her mouth. I thought she looked a little proud. I called Vivian that night. I told her about the letter and the stove. She laughed so hard, she started crying. Dante took the phone from her and asked if I was all right. I told him I was more all right than I had been in 41 years. He said quietly that he was glad. It has been 1 year now. I am 64 years old. I live in the office building. The upstairs storage room has been converted into a small bedroom with a brass bed and a braided rug. The front room is still my grandfather's office with the roll-top desk and the Franklin stove and the north wall of ledgers. I have added a small kitchen off the back, built by Dante during 2 long weekends in April, and a clawfoot tub upstairs that matches the one I had in my little apartment over the bakery. The bakery apartment is now rented to a 26-year-old ceramicist from Burlington who needed a quiet place to work. Hedda told me about her. We take care of each other here. The old flour mill next door is being restored. I put up $150,000 from the bond proceeds, and the town of Hollis put up another $75,000 from a historic preservation grant, and a small committee of us is turning it into a community art space. There will be a woodworking shop on the ground floor, a pottery studio on the second, a gathering hall on the third where the town can hold meetings and weddings and funerals. We broke ground on the restoration in March. The water wheel is being rebuilt by a millwright from New Hampshire. He tells me it will turn again by next autumn. The conservation easement is recorded. The 120 acres are protected forever. I walk them on Saturdays with a pair of hiking boots Vivian bought me for my birthday. I know the names of more of the trees than I did a year ago. Wren Ashdown comes by sometimes with her clipboard. She brings me wildflower seeds to scatter in a small meadow above the brook. Mietta and Ambrose visit every second weekend. Mietta is 12 now. Ambrose is 9. They call the office building Nonna's house. Ambrose has his own cot in the upstairs bedroom. Mietta has the rocking chair Dante made me, which she has claimed as her reading chair, and she reads her grandmother Pina's old Italian cookbooks to me out loud while I cook. She is learning how to make minestrone. Elena Fiorentino comes for lunch every Tuesday. She is 86 now. She drives herself in a 2003 Buick Century that she refuses to give up. She brings me stories. She brings me pieces of peanut. She sat across from me last Tuesday, and she took my hand, and she said, "Your grandmother would be so proud of you, Kara. She would be so very proud." I nodded. I could not speak. She patted my hand. Balthazar Ogunlaya comes up from Montpellier 4 times a year to review the trust. He is 70 now. He still wears a charcoal suit and a pale blue tie. He still drives the silver 2014 Lincoln Town car. We have tea by the Franklin stove, and we look at the quarterly statements together, and he tells me about his grandchildren in Lagos. Pina's framed photograph sits on the roll-top desk. I see her every morning. I say good morning to her out loud. I do not think this is crazy. I think it is the thing I should have been doing for the last 30 years. I keep my own journal now, a green cloth-bound book, narrow, of the same kind my grandfather kept. I write in it every night by the light of the same brass lamp he used, which I had rewired by a local electrician. I write down the small things. I write down the weather. I write down what I cooked. I write down who came to see me. I write down the things I am grateful for. I am trying to leave a record, the way my grandfather and grandmother left a record for me, because you never know which woman 50 years from now will need to find her own ground, and it helps if someone else has written down how they found theirs. I am not starting over at 63. I was 63 when it began. I am 64 now, and what I understand, finally, is that I am not starting over at all. I am stepping onto ground that was always mine. My grandmother and my grandfather had been holding it for me since before I was born. They had kept it oiled. They had kept it dry. They had kept the quiet room quiet until I was ready to open its door. And when I did open it, they were there, in their handwriting, in their purchase deeds, in their gold coins, in their bearer bonds, in the painting on the west wall, and the ledgers on the north wall, and the Franklin stove on the south wall, and the stained glass transom above the front door. They had built a room for me to stand in when I had nowhere else to go. I am standing in it now. I will stand in it for the rest of my life. I want to say one more thing to you before I close the journal tonight and walk upstairs to bed. I want to say it to whoever is listening to this at 2 o'clock in the morning on a pull-out couch in their daughter's den. I want to say it to whoever has been told, after a life of giving, that they are provincial or small or finished or old. I want to say it to the woman who has $18,000 and a Corolla and nothing else. You are not finished. You have not used up your chapters. Somewhere in your family or in your own history or in a room you have not yet opened, there is ground that is yours. You may not know where it is. You may not even know it exists. But it is there. Someone has been keeping it for you. It might be a grandmother. It might be a stranger. It might be you, in a version of yourself you have not met yet. You only have to live long enough, and listen hard enough, and walk far enough, to arrive at its door. And when you get there, the key will fit. I promise you it will fit. It has been cut for your hand. If you have ever been made to feel small after a life of giving, tell me your story in the comments. I will read every single one.